The billionaire's mocking words echoed through the restaurant. Only Aramaic, imagine that. The old scholar's face fell with humiliation, but Maya, a waitress from an Assyrian village, stepped forward. She had learned the language of Jesus from her grandfather. In front of stunned diners, she greeted the scholar in flawless Aramaic. What happened next exposed the arrogance of unimaginable wealth. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go, Dubai, a city of impossible wealth and blinding ambition. The restaurant where it happened was one of the most exclusive in the world, a place where fortunes were sealed over truffle risotto and power was the only currency that mattered. Maya was 28 years old, a waitress who grew up in a tiny Assyrian Christian village where time moved slowly and language meant survival. Her grandfather had taught her the ancient tongue of Aramaic, the very language spoken by Jesus Christ, a heritage he refused to let die in a world that only valued the new. The man who mocked her that night was a billionaire of staggering influence, accustomed to deference. The elderly scholar he humiliated had spent a lifetime preserving the words of a vanishing civilization. What happened in that dining room was more than embarrassment. It was a collision between arrogance and authenticity, and it would ripple through lives in ways no one could have predicted. This is the full story of a moment that proved true wealth has nothing to do with money. To understand what happened in that restaurant, you have to understand the woman at the center of it all. Maya Shamoun was not born into the glittering world of Dubai. She was born in a village so small it didn't appear on most maps, nestled in the Nineveh plains of northern Iraq. The village was called Baghdad, known to some as Karakosh, a place where the streets smelled of cardamom and incense, and the church bells rang out every morning before the sun crested the mountains. For over 2,000 years, the people of Baghdad had spoken the language of their ancestors, a dialect of Aramaic called Shurth. It was the language of Jesus, the language of ancient empires, and it was dying. Maya's earliest memory was sitting on her grandfather's lap, his rough hands guiding her tiny fingers over the pages of a worn prayer book written in Syriac script. His name was Yosef, a man whose face was carved from the same ancient stone as the village itself. He had been a deacon in the Syriac Catholic Church for 60 years, and he had watched his language slowly vanish. He watched young people leave for Baghdad or Mosul, adopting Arabic. He watched television invade homes, bringing foreign words. He watched his grandchildren stumble over sentences he could recite in his sleep. And so he made a sacred promise. As long as he breathed, Maya would know the language of her heritage. Every evening, after the goats were milked and the bread was baked, Yosef would sit Maya down by the olive tree in the courtyard and teach her, not just words. He taught her the stories behind the words, the ancient poems of Mar Ephraim, the healing prayers whispered over the sick, the lullabies his own grandmother had sung. Maya learned that Aramaic was not just a language. It was a vessel carrying the soul of a civilization that had survived empires, persecutions, and exiles. By the time she was 12, she could read, write, and converse fluently. Her grandfather would beam with pride. But even then, deep in her heart, Maya wondered what use it would ever be. When she was 19, war came to the Nineveh plains. ISIS militants swept through the region, and the ancient Christian communities that had thrived for millennia were forced to flee. Baghdad emptied in a single night. Maya, her parents, and her younger brother fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the prayer book her grandfather had given her. Yosef refused to leave his home, insisting that God would protect him. He died 3 weeks later, alone in that courtyard, the olive tree still standing guard over his final moments. Maya learned of his death through a smuggled phone call, and something inside her broke and hardened at the same time. The family ended up in a refugee camp in Erbil, surviving on aid packages and hope. Maya's father found work as a laborer, but it wasn't enough. Desperate for a way out, Maya signed a contract with an agency that recruited workers for the Gulf. She was sent to Dubai, a city of blinding lights and impossible skyscrapers, a city that felt like another planet. For the first year, she worked as a cleaner in a hotel, scrubbing floors until her hands bled. She sent every spare dirham back to her family, She learned English by watching television and practicing with coworkers. She learned the art of invisibility, how to serve without being seen, how to smile when customers treated her like furniture. And all the while, deep inside her, the words of her grandfather lay dormant, waiting. She eventually secured a position at Al Nafora, one of the most prestigious Lebanese restaurants in Dubai. It was a place of staggering opulence, where a single meal could cost more than her monthly salary. The clientele included sheikhs, oil executives, Hollywood celebrities, and royalty. Maya worked the evening shift, gliding between tables with trays of mez and lamb kebabs, her dark hair pulled back, her uniform pristine. She was good at her job because she had perfected the art of being nobody. The wealthy patrons rarely looked at her. She was part of the decor. Among the regulars, one name inspired both awe and fear: Khalid al-Rahmani. He was a billionaire property developer, a self-made titan who had clawed his way from poverty in Sharjah to dominating the skyline of the entire Gulf region. His buildings pierced the clouds along Sheikh Zayed Road. His private jet had a gold-plated bathroom. Forbes estimated his fortune at $3.8 billion. But for all his success, Khalid had a reputation for something darker. He was cruel. His business meetings were legendary for their brutality. He humiliated subordinates, destroyed competitors, and treated service staff like insects. His dinner companions were carefully chosen for their utility, never their character. That night, Khalid had booked the private dining room at Al Nafora for a special guest. The guest was an elderly man named Father Elias Boutros, a renowned scholar from the University of Oxford who had dedicated his life to preserving ancient Semitic languages. Father Elias was 81 years old, with a gentle face and eyes that held centuries of sorrow. He had published 23 books on Aramaic and Syriac linguistics. He had personally documented over 40 dialects before they vanished forever. He was, in many ways, the last guardian of a world that was disappearing, and Khalid had invited him not out of respect, but as a trophy. The billionaire wanted to show his guests that he possessed not only money, but also culture. What Father Elias didn't know was that Khalid had already decided to humiliate him. The old scholar's English was perfect, but his Arabic was halting and heavily accented. To Khalid, this was a sign of weakness, a failure to properly assimilate into the modern Gulf elite. At the start of the meal, as the other guests took their seats, Khalid made a grand show of welcoming the priest. Then, with a smirk that polluted the entire room, he turned to the assembled diners and said, "Imagine, in this day and age, a man who speaks only Aramaic, the language of dead manuscripts, the language of ghosts." The laughter that followed was polite but sharp, the kind of laughter that knows it's being bought. Father Elias' face fell. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded his napkin. He had been invited under false pretenses, paraded as an object of mockery rather than a guest of honor. The other diners looked away, pretending to admire the crystal chandeliers. The old man's dignity was being stripped away in a room full of strangers, and no one was going to stop it. That's when Maya, who had been carrying a tray of water glasses toward the table, stopped in her tracks. She had heard the words, she had seen the smirk, and something inside her, something that had been buried for years under layers of trauma and survival and forced invisibility, came roaring back to life. She thought of her grandfather, she thought of the olive tree, she thought of the prayers that had carried her people through massacres and exiles. Her hands were trembling, but not from fear. They trembled with a righteous fury she hadn't felt since the day she fled her village. She set down her tray, walked directly to the head of the table where Father Elias sat, and in a voice clear and steady, she spoke. "Shlama aluk Abuna," she said, "Peace be upon you, Father." The ancient words filled the silent room like incense. "I am Maya, your servant. How may I serve you tonight?" The old scholar's head lifted slowly. For a long moment, he didn't speak. His eyes searched her face as if he were looking at a ghost. Then tears began to stream down his deeply lined cheeks. He reached out and grasped her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "You speak the language," he whispered in Aramaic, his voice cracking. "You speak the words of my mother, of my grandmother. Where did you learn, child? Tell me everything." And there, in the most exclusive restaurant in Dubai, surrounded by billionaires and gold-plated cutlery, the waitress and the scholar began to speak, in the language of Jesus, in the language of a dying world that had suddenly come alive. Khalid al-Rahmani watched from his seat, his smirk frozen into something that no longer resembled confidence. It looked, for the first time in his adult life, exactly like shame. Khalid al-Rahmani did not speak. For what felt like an eternity, he sat frozen, his fingers curled around the stem of his crystal wine glass. The other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to look at the weeping scholar or the furious billionaire. The entire private dining room had become a stage, and the man who had controlled every scene of his life was suddenly a spectator to his own humiliation. His smirk had crumbled into something no amount of money could fix. Maya did not break eye contact with Father Elias. She continued speaking in the gentle, rolling cadence of Shurth, the dialect of her grandfather, the dialect of the Nineveh Plains. She asked the father if he would care for some water, then to start with the tasting menu. Elias Boutros answered her with trembling joy, his voice thick with emotion. "All these years I feared I was the last," he said in Aramaic. "And now, in a palace of gold, I find a daughter of the ancient ones." The words flowed between them like a river that had been dammed for decades and finally found release. The restaurant staff had frozen by the kitchen doors. The maitre d', a Frenchman named Laurent who had served heads of state, stood with his mouth slightly open. He had seen many things in Al-Nafora: marriage proposals, corporate collapses, even a minor diplomatic incident. But he had never seen a waitress step out of the shadows and shatter the aura of a billionaire with nothing but words. He made a decision not to intervene. Khalid finally pushed back his chair. The scrape of wood against marble sliced through the room. He stood, straightened his jacket, and looked at Maya as if seeing her for the first time. She was not invisible anymore. She was not furniture. She was a force, and he had no script for a force he could not buy. "We are leaving," he announced, his voice flat. The other guests scrambled to follow, their plates untouched. But Father Elias did not rise. He remained seated, still holding Maya's hand, as if the two of them were the only real people in the room. What happened next sealed the night in history. As Khalid walked past Maya toward the exit, he paused. He was close enough that she could smell his cologne, feel the heat of his barely contained rage. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps a threat, perhaps a dismissal, but nothing came. For the first time in decades, Khalid al-Rahmani had no words. He simply looked at her and saw something he could not comprehend, a person who valued something he had spent his entire life trying to escape: heritage, authenticity, roots. He walked out in silence, the glass doors swinging shut behind him like a judgment. The private room went quiet. Father Elias looked at Maya with eyes that held a lifetime of sorrow and sudden hope. "Child," he said, switching to English so that Laurent and the others could understand, "do you know what you just did? You did not merely serve a meal, you gave an old man back his soul." Maya's composure, the armor she had built over years of survival, finally cracked. She began to weep. The tears were not of sadness but of release. Her grandfather had told her that the language would protect her, that it was a sword and a shield. She had never believed it until that moment. The story should have ended there, a quiet victory in a private room. But Dubai in the 21st century is a city of cameras. One of Khalid's own guests, a young tech entrepreneur who had been offended by his mockery, had recorded the entire exchange on his phone. By the time Maya woke up the next morning in her cramped apartment in Deira, the video had already been viewed 2 million times. It spread like fire through dry grass. The clip showed Khalid's dismissive smirk, the old man's humiliation, and then Maya's quiet, dignified intervention. The caption read, "Billionaire mocks guest for speaking Aramaic. Waitress answers in the language of Jesus." The comments were merciless. Khalid's name trended on Twitter across the Gulf. News outlets from Al Arabiya to the BBC picked up the story. By noon, Khalid's phone was a furnace of missed calls from board members, investors, and journalists. His PR team, a legion of highly paid consultants, had no playbook for this. The narrative was not about a corporate merger or a market fluctuation. It was about decency. And decency could not be bought. But the internet, as always, was not satisfied with the surface. It wanted to know who the waitress was. Within 24 hours, they had her name, Maya Shamon. They had her story, a refugee from the Nineveh Plains, a survivor of the ISIS genocide, a woman who had lost her grandfather and her homeland. And they had the words she spoke: "Shlama aluk, Abona, peace be upon you, Father." The Aramaic phrase became a symbol, a hashtag, a rallying cry for displaced communities everywhere. Maya's phone, a simple device she used only to call her family, lit up with messages from strangers around the world. The owner of Al Nafora, a shrewd Lebanese businessman named Samia Haddad, called Maya into his office that afternoon. She expected to be fired. Instead, Samia handed her an envelope containing a 5,000 dirham bonus and a promotion to head waitress. "You have brought more honor to this restaurant than all the celebrities who have dined here," he said. "My mother was also from a village that no longer exists. I know what you carry." Maya accepted with gratitude, but she also sensed that her life of invisibility was over. Across the city, in his penthouse overlooking the Palm Jumeirah, Khalid was not sleeping. The video played on a loop in his mind. He had been humiliated, yes, but beneath the rage, something else was stirring. He couldn't name it at first. It felt like a splinter in his chest, a memory he had buried so deep it had calcified into something unrecognizable. And then, at 3 in the morning, it surfaced. His mother, Layla, her hands worn from scrubbing floors, speaking softly in a language he had not heard since childhood, a language he had been ashamed of. Layla al-Rahmani had been born Layla Barzani, the daughter of an Assyrian family from a village near Mosul. She had fled to the Gulf as a teenager, working as a domestic servant for Emirati families. Khalid's father, a wealthy Arab merchant, had married her in secret, and she had given birth to Khalid in a cramped apartment in Sharjah. She had spoken Shurth to him when he was a baby, sung him lullabies in the same dialect Maya had spoken to Father Elias. But when Khalid was 10, his father's family discovered the marriage and forced a divorce. Layla was sent back to the margins, and Khalid was raised to erase every trace of her. He shed his mother's language, her faith, her heritage, as if they were a stain. He became the purest form of Arab success, and now that stain was bleeding back through the cracks of his carefully constructed life. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had mocked a man for speaking the language of his own mother. He had laughed at the very tongue that had once comforted him in the dark. The shame he felt at the restaurant was nothing compared to the shame that now consumed him in his own bedroom. He had not been mocking Father Elias, he had been mocking the part of himself that he had tried to kill. The next morning, Khalid made a decision that stunned his advisors. He didn't want to sue the person who leaked the video. He didn't want to issue a fake apology. He wanted to find Maya Shamoun and speak with her, not to threaten her, not to buy her silence, but to understand her. His chief of staff, a loyal man named Tariq who had been with him for 20 years, thought he had lost his mind. "Sir, the board is already questioning your judgment. Meeting with the waitress will only make this worse." Khalid's reply was quiet but absolute. "I have spent my life making things worse. Perhaps it's time to try something else." However, finding Maya was not simple. She had no social media presence. Her phone number was registered under a different name. She moved through the city like a shadow. Khalid's security team, the same men who could locate a hostile takeover target in hours, struggled to track down a waitress who did not want to be found. It was Father Elias who finally provided the connection. The scholar had stayed in touch with Maya, inviting her to a small cultural center in Jebel Ali where the Assyrian diaspora gathered. When Khalid learned of this, he did something he had never done before. He went to a church. St. Mary's Catholic Church in Dubai was a modest building compared to the surrounding skyscrapers, but it was packed with worshippers from India, the Philippines, and the Middle East. Khalid sat in the back pew during a Syriac liturgy, the incense filling his lungs, the ancient chants washing over him. He understood none of it, and yet it felt like coming home. He wept. Not the polite tears of a businessman at a funeral, but the raw, ugly weeping of a child who had lost his mother twice. A priest approached him afterward, an old Chaldean man who spoke with a heavy accent. Khalid asked, in halting Arabic, if he could be put in contact with the woman named Maya Shamoun. The request set off a chain of conversations within the tight-knit community. Maya was wary when she heard that Khalid wanted to meet her. "He humiliated a holy man," she told Father Elias. "He is not a good person." The father nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps. But you, child, have a gift that can change hearts. The language you carry is not for hiding. It is for healing. If you refuse to meet him, the story ends here and nothing changes. If you agree, who knows what God might do?" Maya agreed, but on her terms. The meeting would be at a small cafe in Satwa, far from the polished towers of the elite. No security, no cameras, just the two of them. Khalid arrived early, wearing a simple kandura rather than his usual tailored suit. He looked tired, diminished, human. When Maya walked in, she saw not a billionaire but a man carrying an invisible weight. They sat across from each other, a refugee waitress and a titan of industry, separated by an abyss of privilege and pain. Khalid began with an apology that sounded like it had been rehearsed. "I am sorry for what I said at the restaurant. It was arrogant and cruel." Maya listened without expression. She had heard empty apologies before. But then Khalid said something she did not expect. "My mother spoke your language. She was from a village like yours. I punished a stranger for a crime I committed against her memory. I have no right to ask for your forgiveness." Maya's mask slipped. She saw the pain in his eyes, and she recognized it. It was the same pain she carried for her grandfather. "Your mother," she said softly. "What happened to her?" Khalid told her the story he had never told anyone. The secret marriage, the forced divorce, the years of silence, the shame that had curdled into ambition. When he finished, Maya was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Your mother would have been proud of the man you could become, even if she wept for the man you have been." That was the moment the first bridge was built, but it was not the end of the reckoning. Because while they were talking, half a world away in the Nineveh plains, an excavator was clearing the ground where Maya's village had once stood. Khalid's company, Al-Rahmani Holdings, had acquired the land 3 years earlier through a shell corporation. The plan was to build a luxury eco-resort that would cater to wealthy tourists seeking authenticity without the discomfort of actual history. The project's name was Eden Valley, and the irony was so brutal it defied belief. The information arrived in Maya's inbox 2 days later. An anonymous source, a former employee of Al-Rahmani Holdings who had been fired for questioning the project's ethics, sent her the documents. She saw the maps, the site plans, the environmental impact studies that conveniently omitted the existence of the cemetery where her grandfather was buried. She saw the signature of the man she had just forgiven. She stared at the papers until the words blurred. He had not mentioned this. He had spoken of his mother, of his regret, but he had said nothing about the machine that was about to roll over the bones of her ancestors. The question that now demanded an answer was not whether Khalid al-Rahmani could feel shame. It was whether he was capable of stopping the machinery he had set in motion. And if he wasn't, what would Maya have to sacrifice to stop it herself? Maya sat alone in that cafe long after Khalid left, the documents spread before her like a death sentence. She read every page twice, her eyes lingering on the satellite images. The outline of her village was unmistakable, the cluster of stone homes, the narrow streets, the precise location of the olive tree where her grandfather had taught her the alphabet. And there, marked with a red X, was the entire area designated for Phase 1 demolition. Her grandfather's grave was not on the edge of the construction zone. It was directly beneath the site of a planned infinity pool. The audacity was as breathtaking as the cruelty. She folded the papers carefully, tucked them into her bag, and walked out into the Dubai night, the city lights now seeming like the eyes of a predator. The next morning, she did not go to work. She went to St. Mary's Church. Father Elias was preparing for morning mass when he saw her face and knew something terrible had happened. They sat in a small prayer room, and Maya told him everything: the meeting with Khalid, his confession about his mother, and then the discovery of Eden Valley. The father listened without interruption, but his hands, folded in his lap, grew white-knuckled. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "This is worse than you know, child. The land they have taken is not ordinary land. It is the site of Mar Yosef, the church where your grandfather served for 60 years. It is one of the oldest continuous Christian worship sites in Mesopotamia. The foundations date back to the 4th century. The weight of this revelation pressed down on Maya's chest. Her grandfather had not just been buried on that land, he had been its living guardian. The church, though damaged by war, was still a pilgrimage site for Assyrians worldwide. To destroy it for a resort was not just a real estate transaction. It was an act of cultural erasure that the international community would condemn if they ever found out. But someone had clearly worked very hard to make sure they wouldn't. Maya called the anonymous source, the former employee who had sent her the documents. He agreed to meet in a deserted parking lot in Al-Quoz, an industrial area far from the city's glamour. His name was Faisal, a young Emirati engineer who had been fired after raising ethical objections to the project. He spoke in a low, urgent voice, constantly scanning for anyone who might be watching. They didn't just buy the land, he explained. They used a local militia to clear the remaining residents. These were people who returned after the war who were trying to rebuild. They were given 48 hours to leave. The militia was paid through a series of shell companies that trace back to Al-Rahmani Holdings. When I told my supervisor, I was dismissed the next day. Maya felt the ground shift beneath her. The man who had wept in the church, who had spoken of his mother's pain, was either a masterful liar or dangerously disconnected from his own empire. She asked Faisal if Khalid knew. The engineer shrugged bitterly. Maybe not. But that's the point, isn't it? The system is designed so the man at the top never has to know. He profits from atrocity without ever seeing a body. It's the architecture of modern power. Maya thanked him and went home, the puzzle pieces of the last week rearranging themselves into a far darker picture. She called Khalid. It took 3 attempts before he answered. He sounded surprised to hear from her, and beneath the surprise, there was a cautious hope that made what she had to say even harder. She did not soften her words. She told him about Eden Valley, about the church, about the grave, about the militia. She held nothing back. At the other end of the line, there was a silence so profound she thought he had hung up. Then, in a voice she had never heard before, small, hollow, and genuinely terrified, he said, "I didn't know. Maya, I swear on my mother's grave, I didn't know." But vows meant nothing now. The machinery was in motion, and the man who had controlled everything was realizing he had never controlled the most important things. Khalid spent the next 24 hours doing something he had not done in decades. He went into his own company and started asking questions. What he found shattered his remaining illusions. The Eden Valley project had not originated from his usual development team. It had been brought to him by his second-in-command, a man named Rashid Al-Mazraoui, who had been with the company for 15 years. Rashid was the fixer, the man who handled the complicated deals in unstable regions. He had presented the project as a prime opportunity in a post-conflict zone, with local authorities eager for investment. Khalid had signed off on the initial acquisition without ever visiting the site. The documents had been sanitized. The village was described as abandoned. The church was not mentioned at all. When Khalid confronted Rashid, the response was cold and clinical. "Sir, with respect, you can't afford to be sentimental now. The board has been nervous since the viral video. Your emotional state is being questioned. If you try to pull out of this deal, it will cost us over $200 million in sunk costs and penalties. The partners will sue. The sheikh who co-signed the land grant will view it as a personal insult. You could lose everything." Khalid stared at the man who had been his closest advisor, and for the first time, he saw not loyalty but complicity. He had built an empire that would devour his own redemption if he let it. The next blow came from an unexpected direction. A major international human rights organization, alerted by Father Elias' network of scholars and clergy, issued a preliminary report condemning the Eden Valley project as a violation of cultural heritage protection protocols. The report cited eyewitness testimony from displaced villagers, satellite imagery showing fresh demolition, and the historical significance of the Mar Youssef site. Within hours, the hashtag #SaveBaghdad was trending globally, right alongside Maya's original clip. The feel-good story had become a crucible. The board of Al-Rahmani Holdings called an emergency meeting, and Khalid was summoned not as its leader, but as its liability. The atmosphere in the conference room was ice cold. Rashid had already briefed the major investors, framing Khalid as unstable, compromised by an emotional attachment to a waitress. The narrative was grotesque but effective. A vote of no confidence was tabled. Khalid looked around the table at the faces of the men he had made wealthy, and he saw no allies. He requested 24 hours to present a solution. It was granted grudgingly, a stay of execution rather than a pardon. That night, he called Maya again. He did not ask for sympathy. He asked for a meeting, not in a cafe this time, but somewhere truly private. She agreed, against her better judgment, and they met at the small cultural center in Jebel Ali where the Assyrian diaspora gathered. It was a humble building, decorated with icons and photographs of villages that no longer existed. The air smelled of incense and old paper. Father Elias was present, along with two elders from the community. Khalid walked in alone, no security, no entourage. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. He told them what he had learned, the militia, the forced evictions, the complicity of his own company. His voice cracked when he described the moment he signed the authorization documents without ever looking at a real map. "I have no excuse," he said. "I built a machine that destroys. I didn't want to see it, so I closed my eyes. That's not innocence. That's the worst kind of guilt." One of the elders, a woman named Shamaram, whose entire family had been killed in the genocide of 1915, spoke with quiet authority. "Words are cheap, Mr. Al-Rahmani. The question is not what you feel now. The question is what you do. When they bring the bulldozers, where will you stand?" The question hung in the room like a verdict. Khalid met her eyes. "I will stand with you," he said. "But I need to know, if I fight this, if I tear up the contract and face the consequences, will that be enough to save the land?" Maya looked at Father Elias, who looked at the elders. The answer was not simple. Legal battles could drag on for years. The militia had already occupied portions of the site. The church, though damaged, could still be protected if international pressure was applied fast enough and if the local authorities could be convinced to intervene. But every hour mattered. Then came the revelation that turned the situation from dire to catastrophic. Faisal, the whistleblower, had been gathering more evidence. He sent Maya a video file captured from a security camera at the site. It showed a convoy of construction vehicles arriving at the edge of the village, escorted by armed men. The timestamp was from that morning. Demolition had already begun. The excavators were rolling toward the ancient church. Maya played the video on her phone, and the room fell utterly silent. The elder Shamaram covered her mouth. Father Elias began to pray in rapid, desperate Aramaic. Khalid stood frozen, the full weight of his creation crashing down on him. He had wanted to prove he could be different, but the machine was faster than his conscience. The disaster he had set in motion was now happening in real time, thousands of miles away, and he was powerless to reach it. But Maya was not powerless. She turned to Khalid, her voice steady with a resolve that had been forged in refugee camps and sleepless nights. "You have a private jet," she said, "and I have a voice. If we leave now, we can be there by sunrise. Put me in front of those bulldozers and let the world watch what happens next." Khalid looked at her, and in that moment, the billionaire and the waitress became something else entirely. Two people bound by a heritage that the world had tried to erase, about to gamble everything on a single, impossible stand. He nodded. They walked out together into the night, leaving behind the incense and the icons, heading toward a destiny neither could have imagined. And as the jet engines roared to life on the tarmac of Al Maktoum Airport, one question remained. Would they arrive in time to stop the destruction, or would they find only rubble and ghosts? The Gulf Stream streaked through the darkness at 40,000 feet, its cabin silent but for the hum of engines and the occasional crackle of the satellite phone. Khalid sat in a leather seat near the window, staring at the black void outside. He had not slept, could not sleep. The documents from Faisal were spread on the table before him, and he had spent the entire flight tracing each signature, each shell company, each link that led back to his own hand. He was dismantling his own legacy in real time, and it felt like tearing off a limb. Yet beneath the pain, there was something he had not expected: clarity. Maya sat opposite him, her worn prayer book open on her lap. She was not praying for victory. She was praying for peace, for the souls of her ancestors, for the strength to face whatever sunrise would bring. Father Elias had insisted on joining them, despite his age and the protest of his doctors. He was asleep in a reclined seat, his breath soft and rhythmic, the lines on his face smoothed by dreams. The priest had spent his life studying a language most believed was dead. Now he was hurtling toward the land where that language was born, to defend it with his final years. At 6 in the morning, the jet began its descent. Through the window, the flatlands of northern Iraq spread out below, golden in the dawn light. Maya recognized the outlines of the Nineveh plains even from this height. The patchwork of fields, the silver ribbon of the Tigris in the distance, the scattered villages that had survived empires and invasions. Her heart tightened as she searched for the familiar shape of Baghdad. When she found it, she saw the scars of war still etched into the earth, and on the northern edge, the dark specks of heavy machinery. The jet landed at Erbil International Airport, where a convoy of SUVs was waiting. Faisal had arranged them, using contacts from his time in the region. A local driver, a grizzled man named Aram who had once been a taxi driver in Mosul, met them on the tarmac. He spoke in rapid Assyrian, his words tumbling over each other. "They started at dawn," he said. "The militia is there, but so are the people. The villagers formed a human chain around the church. My own cousin is among them, but the bulldozers are still moving. You must hurry." Khalid did not hesitate. He climbed into the lead vehicle, pulling Maya and Father Elias with him. The convoy tore out of the airport and onto the highway, heading west toward the plains. The drive usually took an hour. They made it in 40 minutes, the SUVs kicking up clouds of dust as they navigated checkpoints and cratered roads. Maya clutched the armrest, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She began to see smoke, not the black smoke of war, but the gray dust of demolition. Her stomach dropped. They rounded the final bend, and the village came into full view. It was worse than the videos had shown. Several of the smaller homes on the outskirts had already been reduced to rubble. The steel skeletons of excavators loomed against the sky, their mechanical arms swinging lazily, pausing as if waiting for orders. And there, at the center of the village, the ancient church of Mar Yosef stood defiantly. Its stone walls were pocked with bullet holes from the war, and one of its towers had collapsed years ago, but it was still standing. And standing in front of it, arms linked, were perhaps 200 people. They were villagers who had returned after the occupation, old women in black dresses, young men with determined faces, children clutching small wooden crosses. They were singing. The sound was thin but unbroken, an Aramaic hymn that had echoed through these stones for centuries. The militia guards were positioned between the crowd and the excavators. There were about 30 of them, armed with rifles and wearing mismatched uniforms. Their commander, a heavy-set man with a scar across his cheek, was arguing with a foreman in a hard hat. The foreman was gesturing angrily toward the church, his voice carried by the wind. "We have a contract. We have a deadline. Move them or we will move them." The commander looked uncomfortable. Even mercenaries have limits, and destroying a church in front of a singing crowd was a line many were unwilling to cross. But the money was substantial, and the foreman kept pointing at his watch. Khalid's convoy skidded to a halt at the edge of the confrontation. Dust billowed around the vehicles. Maya threw open the door before the SUV had fully stopped and began walking toward the church. She did not run. She walked with the slow, deliberate pace of someone carrying the weight of generations. The singing faltered as heads turned. Some of the villagers recognized her from the viral video. A woman screamed her name, Maya, the girl from the restaurant. The cry rippled through the crowd, and the hymn dissolved into whispers and gasps. She reached the human chain, and the villagers parted to let her through. She approached the foreman, who stared at her with confusion that was rapidly turning to annoyance. "This is a restricted area," he barked in Arabic. "You need to leave immediately." Maya stopped a few feet from him, her eyes burning. She did not speak Arabic. She spoke the language of this land. "Einer antatakif alan huwa ad mukadasa," she said, her voice ringing out clear as a bell. "The land on which you stand is holy." The foreman blinked, uncomprehending, but the villagers erupted. They understood every syllable. The old women began to weep. The young men raised their fists, not in anger but in triumph. The sound of Aramaic in this place at this moment was like water in a desert. The foreman stepped back, glancing at the militia commander for support. Khalid had followed Maya, with Father Elias at his side. The billionaire walked directly to the foreman and spoke in the language of business. "I am Khalid al-Rahmani. The Eden Valley project is terminated, effective immediately. You will cease all operations and withdraw your equipment. Any contracts you hold are void." The foreman's mouth fell open. He stammered something about legal repercussions, about the penalties that would be incurred. Khalid cut him off. "I am the owner of Al-Rahmani Holdings. I am telling you that this project is over. If you move one more stone, I will personally ensure that your company never receives another contract in the Gulf. Do you understand me?" The foreman looked at the militia commander, who shrugged and signaled his men to lower their weapons. The mood shifted in an instant. The excavator operators, who had been idly watching the standoff, turned off their engines. The silence that followed was more powerful than any explosion. Villagers, stunned, began to realize what had happened, and then the cheering started. It was a sound that rolled across the plains, a sound of relief and disbelief, and joy so fierce it seemed to shake the very stones of the church. Maya walked to the heavy wooden doors of Mar Yosef. She placed her palm against the ancient wood, still warm from the rising sun. She pushed, and the doors swung open with a groan that sounded like an exhale. Inside, the church was dark and dusty, but the altar was intact. The icon of Mar Ephraim, though cracked, still gazed down with serene eyes, and in the corner a small oil lamp was burning. Someone had been maintaining it, even through the war, even through the occupation. The flame flickered as she approached. She knelt before the altar and spoke the words her grandfather had taught her for his own funeral. The prayer of the departed. She had never been able to say it at his grave because she had never known if his grave existed. Now she knew it did. It was here, beneath this sacred ground, and it was safe. Outside, Khalid was on the satellite phone with his board. He did not ask permission. He informed them that the project was cancelled, that he would cover all financial liabilities from his personal fortune, and that Rashid al-Mazraoui was to be terminated immediately and investigated for criminal conduct. The board listened in stunned silence. A vote of no confidence was no longer relevant. Khalid was resigning as CEO, effective immediately. He would retain his shares but step away from active leadership. "I have spent 40 years building an empire," he told them. "I'm going to spend whatever time I have left tearing down the parts of it that caused harm." The militia commander approached him hesitantly, clearly unsure of the protocol when a billionaire fires himself. Khalid spoke to him not as an adversary, but as a man who understood the calculus of survival. "You were paid to be here, the money is gone now, but if you and your men help clear the rubble from those houses over there, I will personally ensure you are compensated for your time. Fair wages for honest work, no more destruction." The commander considered this, then nodded slowly. Even mercenaries prefer to be remembered for building rather than destroying. As the sun climbed higher, the scene transformed. The excavators, so recently symbols of annihilation, were repurposed to clear debris from the damaged homes. Villagers worked alongside the militia, passing stones hand to hand in a chain that mirrored the human barrier they had formed earlier. Women brought flatbread and tea from the surviving kitchens. Children who had been singing hymns moments before were now laughing and chasing each other through the dusty streets. It was not a victory of arms or wealth. It was a victory of presence. And at its heart, Maya stood with Father Elias, reciting the ancient prayers of thanksgiving. The surprising detail came later that afternoon. As the clearing crew worked near the eastern wall of the church, one of the villagers called out. He had found something buried beneath a fallen pillar, a stone box, sealed with wax that had hardened over centuries. Father Elias was summoned, his hands trembling as he gently opened it. Inside was a manuscript, written on vellum in the most exquisite Syriac script he had ever seen. It was a complete copy of the Peshitta, the Aramaic translation of the New Testament, dating back at least 800 years. The box had been hidden during a previous invasion, perhaps by a priest who knew the church would one day be threatened again. It was a message from the past, preserved for this exact moment of resurrection. When Father Elias held it up for the crowd to see, the villagers fell silent, then cheered again with tears streaming down their faces. News of the standoff and the discovery spread across the globe within hours. UNESCO issued an emergency declaration designating Mar Yosef as a protected heritage site. The Iraqi government, eager to repair its international image, pledged funds for full restoration. And Maya's face, already familiar from the restaurant video, became the emblem of a new movement, the preservation of endangered languages and the communities that spoke them. Khalid watched the celebrations from the steps of the church, a quiet figure amid the tumult. He was no longer titan of industry. He was a man sitting on ancient stones, contemplating a future without power, but with something he had never known: peace. Maya approached and sat beside him. They did not speak for a long time. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small glass vial filled with olive oil, blessed by Father Elias. She pressed it into his palm. "This is from the trees of my grandfather's village, the trees that your machines almost destroyed. Take it back to Dubai. Remember that your mother's language is not dead. It is alive, and it has work to do." He closed his fingers around the vial and nodded, unable to speak. The billionaire who had everything had finally been given something he could not buy, and the waitress who had been invisible had become a voice that could not be silenced. The story of what happened in that restaurant had come full circle. A single act of dignity had grown into a global reckoning, but the full weight of that reckoning was only just beginning to be felt. Because when Maya returned to Dubai, she would discover that the board of Al-Rahmani Holdings had not accepted Khalid's resignation quietly. They had found a way to strike back, and the battle for the soul of a fortune and the future of a language was far from over. The board of Al-Rahmani Holdings did not retreat quietly. In the months that followed, Khalid faced a barrage of lawsuits, hostile takeover attempts, and character assassinations in the business press. His former allies painted him as unstable, a man who had sacrificed sound investment for sentimental weakness. But something had fundamentally shifted in the calculus of power. The Eden Valley story had captured the world's imagination, and the public was not on the side of the shareholders. #Save Baghdad had become a rallying cry for diaspora communities across 6 continents. Donations poured into the restoration of Mar Youssef, and the newly formed Assyrian Heritage Trust received enough funding to begin documenting the remaining Aramaic dialects across the Nineveh Plains. Maya did not return to her serving job at Al-Nafora, at least not in the same capacity. Samia Haddad, the restaurant owner, offered her a new role, cultural ambassador, traveling to diaspora communities to share her story and recruit young Assyrians into the hospitality industry with dignity and respect. She accepted under one condition, that a portion of the restaurant's proceeds would fund Aramaic language classes for refugee children. Samia agreed without hesitation. The first class, held in a cramped community center in Erbil, had 17 students. Within 6 months, there were over 300 studying Shurth under the supervision of Father Elias himself, who had relocated to Iraq to oversee the cultural revival firsthand. Khalid, stripped of his corporate throne, discovered a freedom he had never known. He used his remaining fortune to establish the Layla Foundation, named for his mother, dedicated to preserving endangered Middle Eastern languages and providing legal defense for communities facing forced displacement. He became an unlikely fixture at UNESCO conferences, a gray-haired man in a simple suit, sitting quietly in the back rows, listening to linguists and activists. Occasionally, he would approach a speaker afterward and ask, with genuine humility, how he could help. The old Khalid would have demanded a role. The new Khalid simply wrote checks and asked no recognition in return. The surprising detail that no one expected was this. A year after the standoff at Mar Youssef, Maya and Khalid returned to Baghdad together. The restoration of the church was nearly complete. The olive trees, battered but still living, had been pruned and watered. A new generation of children played in the courtyard where Maya had once learned her alphabet. And on a cool autumn morning, under the ancient stone arch of the church door, Father Elias baptized Khalid al-Rahmani into the faith his mother had never been allowed to give him. The water was drawn from the well that had served the village for 1,000 years. The prayers were spoken in Aramaic. Khalid wept, but this time there was no shame, only gratitude. The story of the waitress who spoke the language of Jesus and the billionaire who learned to listen became a parable for our age. But beneath the narrative arc lies an uncomfortable question that refuses to fade. How many languages are dying right now, in this very moment, while we scroll past headlines about crypto and celebrity gossip? How many grandfathers are sitting under olive trees, speaking words that will vanish when they close their eyes, because no one thought to sit and learn? The Aramaic language survived empires and inquisitions, genocide and diaspora. It crossed oceans and centuries to find a waitress in Dubai and a scholar in Oxford and a boardroom in a Gulf skyscraper. And it survived because someone somewhere refused to let it go. The same choice faces every one of us, not just about language, but about what we value. Wealth, status, and power are seductive illusions. They crumble eventually, as all empires do. But the words we pass on, the dignity we extend to strangers, the courage we summon when arrogance demands our silence, these things outlast stone. They echo long after the bulldozers have rusted away. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, and comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support allows us to continue telling stories that the mainstream often overlooks. Share this with someone who needs to hear that a single act of dignity can change the world. And remember, the words of the past might just save the future.